What's up, everybody? This is a very special bonus edition of Sit Down, Shut Up, Mark Out. I am Blade Daly, and for the first time ever, I am joined by the very, very prominent, significant guest, someone with much more education than myself, Dr. David M. Reiss. Dr. Reiss. Dr. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. My pleasure.
We've connected online kind of sporadically over the last year or so, and you have a very interesting story with pro wrestling and with sports. And
Yeah.
I thought, it would be really interesting to kind of dive into the evolution of sports psychiatry, perhaps, or, the evolution of concussion research, because you are heavily connected to Chris Nowinski. And if people don't understand, I want to give a little background. You're a psychiatric consultant to the Concussion Legacy Foundation. And if people aren't aware, that's a group run by Christopher Nowinski, who's a former WWE wrestler, suffered several debilitating concussions in the 2000s that forced him into early retirement. And he then committed himself, because he had the education to concussion research, and ended up being involved in a lot of breakthroughs in our understanding of the cumulative effects of concussions over time, our understanding of CTE, and has informed the policies of wrestling companies like WWE and AEW, and also the NFL. He was a really pivotal media voice in the aftermath of the Chris Benoit murders as well. How did you come to be associated with the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and what is your role there?
I actually don't remember who made the first outreach, whether it was my contacting them, because they're based in Boston, and I did a lot of work in Boston before the pandemic, back and forth, or whether they contacted me, but somehow we made the connection. Mm-hmm. I was already involved with Cauliflower Alley Club, which is informal pro bono, and my work with Chris and CLF is pro bono. And I had other connections, and also a lot of my work is actually through the California workers' comp system. Okay. And I developed sort of a niche in evaluating athletes who file stress claims. And a lot of those are concussion related. So all of that came together. I might have actually met Chris at a meeting of the Sports Lawyers Association. I'm not a lawyer, neither is he. He now has his PhD, but he's not a lawyer. But I'm an associate member, and that might have been where we actually met. And that goes back about 15 years, probably.
Wow. Okay. And so you've worked with the Cauliflower Alley Club, which, if people don't understand, is a wrestling kind of organization for past and former and current wrestlers, right?
Basically a benevolent association. It's not fans are allowed to join, but it's not a fan fest. It's for the industry. They do a lot of charity work for some of the older guys, and they do help the younger people moving up. I haven't been there since the pandemic, but they have an annual meeting every year. Hopefully this year I'll make it.
That's awesome. And the Cauliflower Alley Club, guys, that is basically think of it as the academy, for Hollywood. It's it's the people behind the scenes who are kind of facilitating the care of some people, because the wrestling industry is pretty brutal, especially to older guys and women who have, retired, long since retired. There isn't a lot of post-career planning available to these folks unless they're real wise with their money. And you know what? My experience is artists, and I do consider pro wrestlers artists, not the best financial planners. Let's be real. So
that's probably true.
Yeah. There's a lot to account for there. So they're doing the Lord's work as far as I'm concerned. And if you're a wrestling fan,
most of the years I was working with CAC, Nick Bockwinkel was the president.
Nick Bockwinkel, yeah. Oh, I'm a big Bocker. I love Nick. I'm just a huge wrestling nerd. I'm a huge wrestling fan of all eras, as people who listen to this podcast know. So were you a wrestling fan growing up, or?
My father was an amateur wrestler and boxer.
Okay.
I grew up in the Bronx.
Oh,
And
I couldn't tell.
since I started going back to Boston a couple of years ago, the accent just came right
I
back.
know it is. It is a very interesting blend of
Yeah,
East Coast,
yeah,
East. Yes.
right. But now this goes back to the late 50s and early 60s.
Hmm.
My father I used to watch wrestling with my father. We're talking about Vern Gagne, Antonio Rocca,
Yeah.
all those guys back then. Black and white TV with ears on it.
Yeah.
And I mean, when my mother would go out to play mahjong, my father would let me stay up and watch wrestling.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so you've followed it. Like, did you follow it like kind of throughout your whole life, or did you have it was kind of on and off?
Not really. I mean, I left home for college in '68, and actually, my father passed away that year. And I really didn't have much to do with wrestling. Now and then, in college, we'd watch, but
Hmm.
never heavily involved. I actually got involved in horse racing back then, which is another athletic thing that I was involved with, where it takes no talent on my part. Um, and then I got more involved over the later years, I'd say the last 20 years. And that basically started through my work as comp work and concussion work in general, basically with football players. And then that brought me back into wrestling. I thought, yeah, this is something that I always used to like. And I've always followed it a little bit, but
Yeah.
then got really back into it over the last, probably 20 years.
Okay. Okay. That's awesome. And that makes sense. That definitely overlaps with Nowinski's work too. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
so you're doing like psychiatric consultant work for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and
right.
they have brought so much attention to the real like long-term effects of concussion research. They have warred in a way with the NFL almost at
Oh,
times.
yes.
There's that entire movie Concussion that Will Smith is in that I imagine has a lot to do. I've never seen it, but I imagine it has a lot to do with that. There was an active effort to suppress concussion research, shamefully, I would say.
It would. I'll just say that it would actually be very interesting, and this is on a very serious note. At the Sports Lawyers Association, when you'd have the lawyers for the athletes and the lawyers for the teams getting up and saying their things. Personally, they were very friendly. On stage, it was like we've
Yep.
got to keep our lines straight.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. No, it's all about money at the end of the
Yeah,
day, and
yeah,
I think what's shameful about it to me is these are people who have the money.
yeah.
They this isn't these guys. An NFL player's career lasts for on average what 5 years, 6
5
years.
years roughly. Yeah,
It's such a intense sport and
yeah,
physically excruciating. And
yeah,
that's something I wanted to get into with you. We're not going to be specific at all about who you've worked
yeah,
with in wrestling
yeah.
or anywhere else, but how do professional athletes kind of differ from us mere mortals? How do they cope with being in a field that demands so much of them physically and mentally?
You know, especially when you're working at the professional level. And I've done a fair amount with the indies, which obviously isn't quite as high up. But the professional level, you have to have the type of personality that can deal with some things,
Hmm.
chronic pain, the stress, the traveling, and people at the lower levels, the indies do that also, but it's a bit different. It's not as regular. You're not, I mean, even at the pros, behind stage, a pay-per-view has a whole different feel than a regular taping. And
Hmm.
you think, come on, these are people who've done it for years. They just did it on TV 2 nights ago, but a pay-per-view is a whole different feeling.
Hmm.
So there needs to be a certain mentality. There needs to be a devotion from a clinical side. And this goes for doctors, lawyers also. It takes a certain amount of obsessionality.
Hmm.
There are a lot of OCD running around, which is usually adaptive to a large part. Um, there needs to be pain tolerance, some of which is just natural, some of which is learned. The other thing that's interesting, and I run into it, and we can talk about in terms of concussions, is there's some really good data, and the data is a little bit unclear. But generally speaking, we think, kids in school who have ADD, ADHD are going to sort of be more prone to go into sports rather than academics. So I think we see, and there are some studies that show that there's a higher level of ADD and ADHD in pro athletes than the general population. In wrestling in particular, and stop me if I'm going in a direction you don't want me to.
Go, please.
The unique thing about wrestling is that you're actually trying to protect your opponent. You're not trying to do any real damage, but you're sure as hell causing pain.
Right.
And accepting pain. So it's very different from like MMA or boxing, where you may be best of friends, but the bell rings and you're trying to take each other's head off for real.
Right.
Here you're not. So it's a very different dynamic. And you get some people who go into it because they sort of, in some way, the pain serves a psychological functioning. Some people were cutters before, and this becomes an outlet. But there's a much higher percentage of people with chronic PTSD who are going into wrestling as a way of, without even realizing it, working through. Because if you're really looking at it, it's I'm hurting you for your own good. It's not really a battle. It's we're each hurting each other for our own good, which is sort of what you hear from an abusive parent. I'm hurting you for your own good. So now, does everyone have that history? No, obviously not. But is it more than the general public? Yeah, I have to take that into account.
That is fascinating. Okay, we've already gotten into some good stuff here. So you're saying in wrestling particularly, there is kind of this higher percentage of PTSD in the general population, because as somebody who has been working through my own childhood traumas in therapy and PTSD, perhaps I'm working through something by watching wrestling.
Well, actually, the first talks I gave on this were at Cauliflower, and I didn't pretend I have any ring experience. I mean, since then, I've gotten in the ring to make announcements. That's about it. Yeah. That is it. But it was about the psychology of the fan and why fans gravitate to it. Because the heroes don't get destroyed, they come back. And there's this whole issue of tolerating pain, inflicting pain, switching over from heel to baby face. That's very different than any other sport.
Absolutely.
I'll add one other quick thing. In football, a football player goes in knowing he's or she's probably going to get hurt at some point, but they're doing everything they can to avoid pain and avoid getting hurt. As opposed to go into a wrestling match knowing, expecting, and basically wanting to get hurt.
Yes. Okay. So there's kind
of not
almost
injured, but hurt.
Right. There's like there's an amount of pain that's tolerable, and it's kind of masochistic in a way, I guess you could say.
There's an aspect of that. And again, it's not universal by any means, but more than the average public.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And I don't think wrestling fans really think about it from that perspective very often, but it's actually kind of obvious after you say it, is like, oh yeah. I mean, they know they're going to be hurt. It's interesting because, like, for instance, for me as a fan, and I can't speak for anyone else, but I have no interest in MMA. I have no interest in boxing because I don't want to watch people actually try to kill each other. Right. There's something about knowing that wrestling, it's so funny that the business tried to protect itself for so long and pretend it was real, because part of the draw to me is knowing it's not, that they're not actually trying to kill each other. It's morality play.
I very much resonate with that. I mean, I remember listening to a transistor radio under my pillow to, in those days, his name was Cassius Clay. And listening,
of course. The greatest.
But actually, once I became an adult, I really lost any interest in boxing or MMA. Now, there are a lot of people who like all of them, boxing, MMA.
Right.
I'm one that, wrestling is different because I know it's not intending to really hurt each other.
Right. Right. I don't want to see somebody break their arm on purpose or,
Yeah.
you know, or, you know, you see the unfortunate consequences for somebody
Right.
like Muhammad Ali or
Right. Just getting knocked out. I mean, just
Yeah.
intentionally getting knocked out is a serious concussion.
Yeah, and when you do see a real injury in wrestling, it's very jarring, and you know that's
Yeah.
not supposed to happen. So it
Right.
obviously plays you know, a huge effect
Yeah.
as a fan. You know, it's meant to be drama. It's not meant to be
Right.
life or death.
And what I found very interesting is, you know, I've been backstage any number of times, but a lot of the work I do is remote, so I'm watching the feed often, and usually the inner feed, not the TV feed. And, you know, these people are so good. A lot of times I don't know if they're really hurt or not,
Right.
unless I look for the signals that no one's supposed to see. But they
Wow.
are so good at playing it off and working it that a lot of times I really don't know, and I have to call up and say, hey, doc, was that person really hurt or not?
Right. Right. Well, so there you go. So you're saying like you're watching the inner feed to kind of monitor whether people are showing signs of concussions or other injuries, or
I mean, I'm not really watching clinically that way. I'm noticing it, but that's not the purpose. Actually, I watch, so I'm up to date on the storyline.
Okay.
You know, because I enjoy watching.
That's
But
great.
obviously, if there is a real injury, I'll jump on it. And then when we have a med meeting, I may reach out to someone and say, look, I'm not saying you have a mental health issue. I'm not saying you need therapy. But if you want to just chat about what you're going through, just give me a call. And often they do, because it's tough to be on the shelf and in pain.
So let's talk about that. So injuries are obviously, you know, it's going to happen, but they are detrimental in wrestling in a way that they may not be otherwise, right? Like, you know, if you're a boxer, you're an MMA guy, and you get hurt, you get your leg broken or something, right? You're still the guy. You're still the girl. You're still like significant in wrestling. You could be right in the middle of a push, and an injury can change everything, right? And certainly in the older times, you know, if you were marked as injury prone, that really could limit your career.
Yeah.
What is it like to talk to people about injuries, and how do they deal with it? And how do you, what do you see as a positive way of coping with injury in professional wrestling?
You know, it runs the gamut from people who basically maintain a lot of denial, and it's not going to happen to me, to most people who say, well, they talk about, I have my bump card. And I know there are only so many bumps on my bump card, and if I'm getting close to maxing out my bump card, I really need to be careful and think about it. And I've had people I've seen after injuries who said, well, should I do something else? Should I? You know, usually if they can, they go back, even if while they're hurt, they think they're not going to.
Right.
But part of my job working with someone like that, even if it's not really clinically therapy, is just saying, yeah, it's valid for you to consider options. I'm not going to tell you one way or another what to do, but the fact that you're injured, to stop and take a look and consider your age and all of that makes sense. And as you say, you know, obviously in any sport, if you get seriously hurt, you're going to get dropped off the roster or whatever. But it's not like wrestling where there's a storyline where, as you say, someone might be getting a push, and even a relatively minor injury that just has you out for 2 or 3 weeks. It's not like, okay, I'll play the next game. By the time it's the next game, there's a whole new storyline, and you may not be part of it. So it's complicated.
It is. It is a very complicated thing. And, you know, pro wrestling is a one-of-a-kind form of entertainment. And I think that's why people are such hardcore fans of it, right? Is because we can give automatic feedback. It's a story. It's like a soap opera that's happening with these tremendous athletes. I think some of the greatest athletes in the world. And we can cheer or boo it in real time. You're not at home yelling at the TV necessarily, right?
Right. No, it's very different. And do we have time for me to tell a quick little story? And I can use a name here because it's someone that I have no clinical connection with.
Okay.
This is from CAC. The first time I spoke at CAC, they wanted to team me up with an old pro to give me some cred because I had no credibility. Who am
Right,
I?
right.
Old white-haired. Well, I wasn't as old, but I was a white-haired shrink. So I was on stage with Ted DiBiase, Senior. And I was talking about just what we were talking about the dynamics of pain and dealing with it. And then he started telling stories, and we were going back and forth. And when I'm saying, look, you all are basically recapitulating child abuse, I didn't know if I'd get out with my ass intact.
Right.
But at the end of it, Ted turns to me on the dais in front of probably 200 people and says, now I know why I did all the crazy shit I did for all those years.
Wow.
And I was over.
Yeah, you got over with the wrestlers. Yeah. No, that's incredible. Wow. Okay. So, because Ted has such a unique story himself, his adopted father dying in the ring. Mike DiBiase was his dad, and I believe he died of a heart attack in the ring. So, yeah, no, that's very interesting. Critically, you get injured, they have to change their plans, right?
Right.
And then how do they slot you back in when you're ready to come back? You look at some of the more notable names. Jamie Hayter was out for a really long time with a very significant injury, and she's talked openly about, she wondered, like, will I ever, maybe I should retire, maybe I shouldn't come back. And I'm not saying you two have a clinical relationship. I'm just saying she's been very open about it.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine, as an athlete, when you are used to like your body functioning at this incredibly high rate, that makes a normal person look less than ordinary, when your body, when you can't walk all of a sudden, or your wrist doesn't work or whatever, that must be incredibly debilitating psychologically.
Of course, they're all used to relatively minor injuries.
Right.
Relatively speaking, but the major injuries, they can be really devastating.
Mm-hmm.
But, the other side of it is, and this goes for football, and I see hockey players at times, I'll often ask people, when was the last day that you woke up and you weren't in pain? And the typical answer was probably my sophomore year in high school.
Right. No, it's just hard on your body, and nobody's ever 100%. It's like, that is the benefit. That is for teenagers. That is for, early 20s, maybe. But if you are an athlete for a living, you are in some kind of pain, you have a sprained ankle, you have whatever. And that's just ordinary stuff. That's nothing exceptional. Okay. So what do you feel fans may not understand about being a pro wrestler and the highs and lows of kind of being such a public personality? And I say that because we live in a society that is so parasocial, right?
Yeah.
And with social media, we feel kind of more connected to the wrestlers than we ever have. And what's an interesting phenomenon that I notice about this is that in a way we feel like we can connect with them in a greater way than we ever have, but we also fetishize that connection in this way where we think we're connecting with the person in the screen, not a real human being.
Right.
And so kind of what are the highs and lows of that?
I've seen a significant change in that over, let's say, the last roughly 10 years with social media. It used to be that, obviously they put, even in public, tried to maintain their persona.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back 35 years. I was at an airport in Moline, Illinois, and Bobby Heenan and the Crusher walked in. And they just walked in to get a meal. It was a restaurant there in the evening. And as soon as they saw they were recognized, they went into character. And they ate the whole meal in character. That's changed.
Yeah.
And now with social media, there's all the interaction. When Facebook first started, I connected with a couple people, DMing, because they know I had some connection. And you knew you were connecting with a real person. Mm-hmm. They also weren't making money off their social media.
Right.
Now it's not only all the typical social media, but the Patreon, OnlyFans, all of that stuff having, so that it's very different, and they manage their social media. And it's interesting because, like on Facebook, even if someone is getting a lot of negative pushback, or trollers, if it's generating movement, they're getting paid more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different dynamic as to what do you do with your personality? How do you make it work?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just to get, like we used to say, asses in the seats at the next show.
Right.
It's also, how much am I going to make off Facebook this week?
Right. Right.
So it's a very different dynamic from both sides.
Okay. That's great perspective. So I guess my question then is, I have been a performer myself in different avenues. Sometimes I think people who are performers struggle to manage, like, who is the performer me versus the real me, right?
Yes.
Like, it would seem to me that when you have the OnlyFans you and the Patreon you and the wrestler you, they are all juggling. Like, the real person sometimes can definitely get lost in the middle of all that right?
Absolutely. And, you see some people who have a really good hold on it and can turn it on and off.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm talking to them, and I'm not talking about talking to them clinically, I'm talking about just chatting.
Right.
You would never know they were even an athlete.
Uh-huh.
There are other people who get lost in it.
Right.
And, people in the locker room will know, watch out for this person, because they don't know how to get out of character. They live their character. Or sometimes it's the other way, that who they really are became the character.
Sure.
But it covers the whole spectrum. And especially these days where they don't try to maintain kayfabe, that, knowing when to be on, when to be off, it's tricky, and there are disagreements, between people, between management. And I'm not talking about anything specific about how far do you go revealing your real person, when do you stay in character. It's tricky, and it also depends on the person's character. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's some characters which are more, it's easy to just be a real person. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to mention names, but there are a lot of people you could just see, okay, yeah, I can talk to them as a real person. Mm-hmm. You don't expect to ever talk to The Undertaker as a real person.
Right.
Which he is. But
when I first started watching, I was born in 1980, and I started watching when I was 9, so 89, and that was the year the McMahons went in front of the New Jersey Athletic Commission and said, "Hey, this is not real," right? And it didn't hit for me as a fan that the business was admitting the work of it until the internet really hit.
Yeah.
And so kind of it seemed like WWE somewhere in the late 90s kind of was like, hey, this is a show, guys. Like, it's a show, I maybe could have picked up on that when they had a trash man as a wrestler and, the guy who skins alligators or whatever. But like, I didn't really pick up that they were freely admitting that till the late 90s with the Attitude Era, maybe. And when AEW came along, it seemed to me like Tony Khan was like kind of experimenting with like, how do we reintegrate kayfabe a little bit, with specific people. It seemed like MJF or people like that who really, like, if you're in front of a fan, you're not breaking kayfabe. Yeah. And it's been interesting to see how the public receives that now that they know it's, the companies have admitted that it's a work, and Tony Khan himself, obviously admits that it's a work, but certain wrestlers, like I've seen them be criticized for not breaking kayfabe.
Right.
It's so interesting, the duality of all that and how it's kind of collapsed in on itself in a way.
Yeah. I remember the first WWE, it was WWF in those days, house show I went to, which was post that. And at the end of the show, off TV. I don't know if it was even televised. It may have just been a pure house show. Everyone came out and just did their finishing move on everyone else. No storyline. And it was the first time I realized, even I'm sucked into the fantasy of it because this just doesn't feel right.
Right.
But it's very different these days. And, speaking for myself, there's still people who I've met who, I'm surprised when they're not who I thought they were.
Right, of course.
Intellectually, I know, but emotionally, you buy into it.
Right. And I think that is the thing that is so unprecedented about pro wrestling is where the lines are different almost for everyone. Like certain people like an MJF or somebody like that can, and again, no names mentioned here, have any therapeutic relationship to Dr.
Not mentioning anything to anyone. No.
We are just giving examples of people who have publicly been this way. I just want to be clear about that. But like the MJF example is like, this is a guy who's made a decision about like how he wants to represent his character. He is fiercely dedicated to it and he doesn't give a shit what people say. But you see him make little character tweaks here and there. He's listening. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's a very smart man. And, but yes, when you don't know where the lines are, because I, as a fan, know it's a work. And when I see something that's too obviously fake, I go, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
But it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit.
But, and this is going to date me, but what the example I've used for 30 years is, you can go to a James Bond movie and during the movie you are totally into it and they are their characters.
Right.
There's James Bond, there's Dr. No. If you met Sean Connery on the street, you wouldn't expect to meet a spy.
Right.
You'd expect to meet an actor.
Right.
But with wrestling, if you meet so-and-so on the street, you still don't expect them to be their character. Maybe intellectually you don't, but on an emotional level you do. Right.
Well, and there's more to it than the intellectual perception of it, right?
Yeah.
So it's it's such a unique art form, and that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
You have those guys like the Nick Bockwinkel's from back in the day who tried to represent wrestling, or Vern Gagne, or that AWA, that entire AWA brand, where they tried to represent wrestling as realistically as possible. I'm reading Lou Thesz's book Hooker right now, and Lou is obviously very involved in the Cauliflower Alley Club when he was alive. And, that was the name of the game back then. They had to. Right. They were dealing with these athletic commissions that were like, hey, is this on the up and up? Because if it's not, you have to say that it's not. And, you kind of see the evolution of these relationships, right? But it's such a different thing now.
And which brings up an interesting point, and again, without going to anything specific, but some states still have wrestling under the athletic commission.
Right.
Some states don't. So when you're planning matches, you have to take into account what state you're in, because there's some states you can't do stuff that you can do in other states. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I live in Washington State, and Washington is famously regressive with the way it with its laws around pro wrestling. For a long time, we just didn't get any indie wrestling at all because you couldn't afford to do it. The insurance or the having an ambulance on hand at all times and all of that stuff was way too expensive for an indie promoter. And we've changed some of that. But I know, WWE didn't even come here for long periods of time because it was just too expensive to run shows here because they were regulated like a sport and regulated the same way boxing was regulated. And they're obviously very different things. That's why the McMahons admitted that it's a work to begin with in New Jersey.
And even the use of blood, gigging, very different in different states what the rules are.
Yes, exactly.
Generally pretty much the same all over, but there are isolated states where it's very different.
So, maybe my last point here is last question for you.
Yeah.
I would love to do this again sometime because
because we'll get into concussions and all of that.
Oh my God. Yeah. There's so much more we can cover, and we will.
Yeah.
I promise the listeners we will cover more. But just work-life balance as a wrestler. Let's take that one step further. So you had mentioned indie wrestling earlier, right?
Yeah.
It's such a different game than being a nationally televised wrestler, right? Where you're like,
Definitely,
you're doing anything you can for attention. You are trying to get noticed by anyone, right?
Yeah.
And I did that as a musician, right? I when I say professional musician, I was a working musician. I wasn't like making big bucks or anything. But so I feel like I relate to indie wrestlers in a lot of ways. But when you're in that national televised spotlight, you're in a different town every week. Maybe you have kids, you're married. Right. There's a lot to manage.
It's a lot to manage. Relationships, family, and it's different from other sports because there's no off season.
Right.
Yes, a football player or even a baseball player is a longer season. During the season is traveling, but they're not traveling 3 times a week.
Right.
And then they have a whole season where they're not doing anything but basically staying in shape at home.
Right.
So it's very taxing on relationships. It's very, very taxing on what do I do with my spare time, just the traveling, the crossing the time zones. Basically every week of the year we're crossing time zones. So it's difficult and it's stressful. It's stressful on the body, even if someone's in very good mental condition to be able to handle it. I'm not saying it causes pathology, but it causes stress and it causes problems that have to be managed.
Right. Right. And physically flying that much is really hard on your body too. And these people are famously large, like they're big people. So like
most of them are.
Yeah. So like a lot of them are pretty gigantic people trying to navigate being in the air a lot, uncomfortable seating maybe. Or they need special accommodations because, I'm trying to think of a good example, like a Powerhouse Hobbs or somebody like that. That dude doesn't just fit conventionally in a seat.
Not without a really big shoe on.
Right. That guy needs some leg room, It's yeah.
But if I could just move clinically for a second, because this is a really good point, is even when I'm working with people, let's say in terms of some people do need antidepressants or other medications. One, athletes respond differently, but also I run into a lot of problems like with insurances, with pharmacies, because everything is evidence-based. Well, what is the evidence based on? Studies for the average person. The average person is a 5'10" white guy who's 40. He's not a 6'10".
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of docs don't realize you have to do things differently because these people are different and there are no good studies on what works and what doesn't work for this very unique population.
See, and this is just stuff I never think about, and who would, right? Unless you have some medical experience, right? Like
I learned it trial and error.
It's trial and error, and dosage and what kind of medications are going to work. And then, the way these people eat and die and work out and, like I'm sure chemically there's like a whole.
And of course, then you get to, and again, I'm not mentioning, the steroids. And these days, now that it's legal, if you know someone who's not using weed, let me know.
Yeah, exactly.
And, a lot of times, and this is not referencing any one organization or anything. It's, is this concussion? Is this anxiety? Or is this weed?
Yeah, right. No,
or ADHD.
Yes. And I think, that coming back to that, let's talk about that for a minute. So with the ADHD, I think, I have ADHD for one. And I know that I didn't know that until just a few years ago. I am a 5'8", 45-year-old wrestling fan, white guy. And I didn't know that until a couple years ago. And I look back in my life, I'm also in recovery because I was treating that anxiety, ADHD kind of compulsion with alcohol and weed. That was a huge part of how I treated it. And the weed eventually, as I got older, created more anxiety for me to deal with instead of helping me escape it. But it was this ritualistic thing, right? I can only imagine inserting steroids into the mix, you know?
And realistically, alcohol is never good, basically. It causes so many problems.
It does.
Weed has so many different chemicals in it. There are some that probably are therapeutic, but it's trying to sort out which are and which aren't. And if you come off it, that can create depression. And even the chemicals that do help as an anti-inflammatory can still cause memory problems. So it's complicated.
Yes, no, it really is. And I don't want to stand up too much on a soapbox here, but I quit booze by smoking a lot of weed. And then a year later, I quit weed. And that was the most depressed I've ever been in my life, because I was if I had the day off, like I woke up and got high, and I was that kind of stoner. And this was before it was legal, before dispensaries, before all of that. And so I will say that it is not as easy to cope with as people might think. And when you're a wrestler and you're trying not to abuse pills and you're trying not to abuse alcohol as pain relief or whatever, what else do you have? And so, yes, wrestlers are famously stoners. I do know this. When it was revealed to me that Bobby the Brain Heenan, the sharpest, quickest guy in the history of the wrestling business, was a major stoner. Jim Ross has confirmed this. I realized, they're probably all stoners then, because if he could be that quippy and be that baked, like I respect it. I do. Well, Dr. Reiss, we have so much more ground to cover, and we will, but
I'm glad to. And you couldn't, I could tell you stories for ages if you're interested.
I want to hear them all. So if we do 10 parts of this thing, we will, but I thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for your work in the field. Thank you for educating our audience, because I think that pro wrestling fans are in many ways the best, and in some ways the absolute dog shit worst. And we could be better with more understanding, hopefully, of what these athletes go through. And I'm all for spreading that to the masses in the ways that I can. So thank you so much.
Makes sense, and my pleasure, really, anytime.
This has been Sit Down, Shut Up bonus edition. We'll be back very soon with Dr. Reiss again.